Anyway, we are ready now. So I'll invite, you don't like to be called Mike, so see, Sargan. Would you please introduce yourself and it's all yours. Just one question. I understand. Just explain to us the format that you want to have, because I understand you have a series of provocations. So just explain to us how you want us to
Yeah.
participate.
So I guess for starters, I was going to say by way of introducing myself, I'm new to this community, so I'm not quite sure what the norms are, and I'm going to probably want to feel it out a little bit. I have quite a bit of content, but I'm also used to talking to people who don't know much about cybernetics, so that might mean I don't have all that much content. I'm not sure. I cut out things that were like, yeah, too much explaining things that I think people here will already know. So in terms of cadence and feel, I would say um, at least initially, I'm interested in someone stopping me and asking questions, but I think ideally I want to get through some of the material about my thinking and then like shift into a mode that's more open. But because I'm not sure how long things are going to take, I think I'm going to lean towards more presentation to get it done and then very open discussion that follows. But I'm happy to let that change if it feels right. Um,
Great. That's perfect. That's the way we normally do. So it's all yours. You let us know when you want to start the questions, and people can put questions in the chat in the meantime, and we will facilitate these questions to be responded by you at the right time. Okay?
Sounds good. So I guess I'll just dive into it. Can you guys can see my screen okay?
Yes, perfect.
Great. So the topic is from viable organizations to viable ecologies. And the thing that I'd really like to be talking about with you all is how our perspectives on systems ultimately change the systems we build. But I'm going to do this through a little bit of exploration of ideas and then some of my own work and then open it up into provocations. And actually, here's my outline. I'm going to do some cartoon drawings, then a little hook on some work that I've or how I think about things, talk about some slightly more detailed conceptual frameworks and some of my experiences in practice, and then get into these provocation discussions. And ideally, I'd like to go about even between part one and part two. But I might actually be able to get through it faster because I'm actually really interested in what everybody has to say. So with that, I will get started. I think rather than trying to do bio about myself, I'm gonna let that hang. I think some of it will come out through the topics. All right, so motivation, fractals, and networks. So I don't actually have to describe this to this group, so I'm going to say I made a cartoon drawing of a VSM. This is here so that I can make drawings. Um, if I actually need to review systems 1 through 5, I will do it, but I think that this is not the place to do that. So here's my cartoon. And now, obviously, this is reductive, but one of the things I've always liked about VSM is this fractal nature of it, the idea that you could kind of like unpack and find more of the same pattern. But if I come back to centering on this, I'm going to talk also about networks. And so we start to think about the environment and the ways in which we're sort of sensing and reasoning about or building models of the world and the future versus like interacting directly with our various primary modes of production. And so there's these other things in the world, but they're also part of something. So we're like, okay, but actually it's more like this. But all I've really done is reframed the problem, right? Like I could also think of that as an organization, or like basically what I'm getting at here is I like really love VSM as a conceptual frame, but what I like about it is the fact that it is very modular. Like I can kind of plug and play and take it as a lens and look at a thing, or like zoom out and look at another thing, or even change the slice of the world that I'm taking. And in fact, this is where I want to kind of start off is so this idea that viability could be argued as relational, that like actually the notion of a system's separate existence as defined relative to environment is better understood as a frame of reference. So like I have to draw a dotted line around a slice of the world and then say that's a system and then reason about its viability. But because I can move the dotted lines around, I actually prefer to think of these systems ecologically. Co-fitnesses, the ways in which systems are understood as codependent on one another, which is a little bit of a movement away from this, dotted line slice, maybe this firm or entity that I am trying to constitute or organize, versus like, really thinking about its externalities in immediate and distant sense. And I actually think this is really important in our current era, where actually we have some really efficient organizations that are really good at achieving their immediate objectives, their stated objectives, but often at the cost of externalities on other related systems. And so moving towards this fractal and networked model, I think is going to be critical, especially insofar as the models that we use to represent the world then in turn inform various computer systems, decision-making systems, estimation decisions. Small note, I'm a control theorist by formal training, so like basically everything can be reduced to some sort of, estimation and decision problem, but obviously that itself is predicated on a model of the world. And that model of the world has huge effects on what those decision systems actually do. In any case, I'm really interested in viewing this relationally. I will also grab another point of reference, which is I also like the way that Ashby talks about organization. So not just variety, I like the way that he talks about organization, in part because he really emphasizes the way things are related. So this is, again, very topological network. Like the components are organized in certain ways can be as important as what the components are. And again, as a actually systems and control engineer, I worked on dynamic network optimization problems during my dissertation work, and I've worked on a wide range of networked systems. And so I'm very attached to the idea that the topology of a system is an important way of understanding its behavior and its potential behavior. And so again, here I'm going to like lean into this relationality. And so kind of my hypothesis is that cybernetics is closer to differential topology than to like closed dynamical systems modeling. Again, the control theorist in me is like, well, I mean, it's really nice to draw an autonomous dynamical system and say, haha, it goes from here to there. Even if it's chaotic, you suddenly feel like you understand it. But in truth, we cannot and should not pin down precise laws of motion for complex systems, but reason about open systems and how the current configuration of those systems determine possible future configurations. This relates to things like reachability, controllability. Formally speaking, I'm really interested in saying, hey, a particular organization is capable of exhibiting certain properties, but it's also capable of governing itself, reconfiguring itself, which in fact changes what it's capable of doing. The slice of this, which is really the only math I'm going to throw at you, is kind of a pitch to check out a paper that I wrote with a colleague, Jamshid Shorish, on generalized dynamical systems. And basically, we take dynamical systems models and we just take the metric spaces out of them. And we talk about these abstract spaces that can be anything, and we work with something that's a little closer to a differential inclusion. It's discrete, and it's defined in terms of the admissible actions or the set of inputs that can be processed into new states. They're discrete. They work really well for helping design anything that has a discrete time notion or event time notion and where there are computers involved, because really managing the separation between human behavior and like procedural behavior can be pretty gnarly. So this is for the math types. Please check out this generalized dynamical systems paper. I'll share a link later. And that is the end of my like initial motivation. It's meant to give you a little bit of a sense of who I am and what I'm interested in. So I am actually going to pause for a second before I go into some actual like material. So if anybody has questions, comments, concerns.
Thank you very much. Let's wait and see who has a question or a comment. Well, I have a comment. while other people join, I really like the way you are conceptualizing the VSM. I think that several people here in this community have been trying to produce this shift into sort of clarifying the misunderstanding of some people of the VSM as something that cannot deal with complexity or doesn't understand the fact that organizations are relational, and that what both Ashby and Bia were talking was about relationships rather than mechanic systems going to feedback loops in a very mechanistic way. So I think that this clarification is very important, because it's the way that we in the community have been progressing towards an understanding of organizations as complex systems that are relational systems. And this is like the fundaments in which we can talk about other aspects of understanding complexity, as I'm pretty sure you are going to share with us in a minute. Yeah. So thank you for that.
Z, maybe I could jump in here. I'm looking forward to your talk from the prelude here. This issue of how, when you take a VSM or any other discrete, entity, and then you say, how does it interact with the rest of the world, I think is really challenging. And I've never actually met Jose Rios, but he has a diagram out there somewhere that just blew my mind with these blue pipes, and you start realizing, oh, somebody's really thought about how any particular organization is not just in a hierarchy, a nested hierarchy of that organization, but it's actually in a lot of other nested hierarchies. Ostrom and others are, trying to talk about that. But I think graph theory, network theory, I think is the only way to not box yourself in, so you can ask these kind of questions. I'm really excited to see what you have to say. And thank you, Jose, who we've never met, but
Awesome. I think thank you for the feedback, and that I'm excited to talk to people who also think this way about models, and in particular models of organizations. So this section is going to. Oh,
sorry, one comment from Bernard.
Go for it.
Yeah, I have. So I find it very interesting. I liked very much how simply you described this thing about the dotted line drawing around a system or an organization, and then call this a system. And especially, I think, you pointed out the problem is that often we don't really talk about what this dotted line means. And I'm based in Switzerland, so part of my intellectual kind of ecosphere is German speaking as well. And I use the definition of organization of Luhmann. About making a difference between a social system which is an organization and a social system which is not an organization, because then things that happen over this dotted line and then into what we draw as the system itself or the organization itself have a different we can observe them in a different way, and we claim that they are different when that system that we observe is actually an organization and not something else, a network, for example. And so I was wondering, what is the concept that you work with in terms of making a difference between organization and other kinds of systems?
I would say that I generally think about two completely distinct conceptions of organization. One in the sense of a kind of a effectively social definition that amounts to, a group of people, processes, infrastructures, tools, essentially a kind of, constituted or instituted socioeconomic apparatus that shares resources, et cetera. There's a kind of again, a kind of institutionalized notion of an organization, versus like the verb to organize, which I would include graphs in, for example. Graphs organize things. They take a bunch of nodes and assign edges and describe relations. A dynamical system on a graph could be a set of process flows over the edges. Maybe the edges have capacities, and maybe the nodes have some routing decision power. But like ultimately that topology or that dynamical system represent an organization, but not in the sense of the socioeconomic system necessarily. And so you gotta like kind of couple apart almost like a political sciencey or sort of social construction of organization from a sort of like literal like description of a set of relations.
Yeah. Then I take
I
the
use both.
to translate my question into a suggestion. I think I personally do the similar thing that from you. I work a lot with practitioners who don't know about VSM and things like that. And also this question of how do you translate stuff is very very important for me. And I have made very good experiences with Luhmann's definition of organization with purpose, membership, and hierarchy of decisions. And you can do a lot of things about how organizations should work, and especially nowadays when people are talking about collaboration in ecosystems and things like that. I see you can point out a lot of dysfunctionalities when ecosystems are treated as if they were organizations and they are not. So maybe that's just as a little suggestion. I think it's
helpful.
very
I think
helpful.
you'll
I think
like where this is going.
your approach very, very well.
Yeah, I think you'll like where this is going. So the first thing I'm going to do here is talk about briefly about the ways that I think about this, which is to say very interdisciplinarily. This is again, a bit of a reduction, but I think about governance in terms of orienting and like deciding what our actual goals are. There's a certain amount of like subjectivity in governance necessarily, whether it's through formal mechanisms of governance that are encoded in law, or those that are sort of expressed through culture and norms, and whether we're talking about an organization or a network or ecosystem. Ultimately, there's a much higher amount of, let's just say, subjectivity in a good way emanating from this thinking about governance and political science and sociology, etc. The economics layer I think of as more focused on resources, constraints. It's almost like energy balance or resource balance equations. You've got resources, you've got actors, you've got ways in which those resources are allocated across those actors. And then ultimately we have technology, which is effectively the kinds of tools and practices that we produce that facilitate the allocation of these resources or achieving specific, like the technology provides us means to achieve ends, but insofar as the ends are emanating from economics, I tend to think of them as like proximate. They're like an immediate kind of end, which is potentially objective, like you're solving an optimization problem that has already been framed, whereas governance is like the space in which we actually sort of quote frame the optimization problem or choose the boundaries of the model and bear the consequences of those subjective choices. This is more meant to give a sense of like the breadth of work, because I'm drawing on all three of these fields, and I actually you'll see this in later, like I had a whole like kind of research unit built within my R&D company that separates into three separate seminars that focus on both people with expertise from and literature in these different areas. And so taking this reduction and quickly blowing it up, I won't spend the time to describe this at length, but this is like almost like a whiteboard sketch of like, okay, cool, I made a nice pretty diagram, but actually the way that these concepts are interacting with each other is non-trivial. But the point here is what we actually care about is like what people do and like what the consequences of that are. And so insofar as technologies provide structure or fulfill functions, economics define resources or characterize actors, and governance provides like both formal and informal like kind of guidance or direction about what to do. We ultimately get these incentives, we get these capabilities, and people take the can do and the should do, and then they do something, and then stuff happens. And put my point earlier, I'm not actually trying to reduce this to some sort of predictable deterministic. I'm just trying to describe the phenomena through which these things evolve and to understand those evolutions. So the slide change comes from the fact that I grabbed this from a talk that I gave at an event at Harvard I guess last year, almost a year ago. And so I'm going to talk about infrastructures and institutions for a second, because I think that it's really interesting how similar these things are. So institutions, this is a kind of canonical institutional economics definition. They are humanly devised structures of rules and norms that shape and constrain individual behavior. Douglas North. So, okay. Now I'm going to break that apart and be like, okay, infrastructures, they're generally humanly devised, developed, operated, and maintained. They're structures. They enforce or embody some rules. Sometimes they're like physical analog rules if they're physical infrastructures, but also we have like digital infrastructures, which actually are just different implementations of a pretty similar concept. And they do tend to engender norms, right? They create or embody rules, and they do constrain behavior. And in response to those constraints, we also see shifts in norms. So we've got some, let's say, analogousness between infrastructures and institutions. And so I want to take a sort of more systems engineering way of looking at institutions. And so to your comment earlier, I've got two of these three things more or less in common with the heuristic that you provided, or the definition you provided. So we're really, this comes from a paper I wrote with a constitutional scholar and institutional economist by the name of Eric Alston, as well as Ilan Ben-Meir and Kelsey Nabin, who some of you met previously. We're starting to try to understand these institutional analyses in a slightly more technical engineering way. So we've got purpose. Think of this as goals, objectives. Like, what are we trying to accomplish? We've got environment, which is effectively this context in which we are undertaking this, which accounts for things that are out of our control generally. You could think of it as constraints. So if purpose and environment are objectives and constraints, then like people, in our case, are either could be viewed as constraints in the sense that they define the other side of the boundary, or we could actually think about them as a kind of motive, or the update to the algorithm. If we're using an optimization algorithm analogy, there's a non-trivial dependence on the actors within the system about how that objective is pursued subject to those constraints, not necessarily suggesting this is a optimization problem with a unique solution. So we may just be doing some kind of stochastic gradient descent or something really systematically organized, but ultimately we're pursuing a purpose subject to some constraints. And so while this writing is less focused on mathematics and optimization theory, like much of my intuition about it relates organizations to, or at least institutions more broadly, because the institution definition can actually contain the ecosystems and the networks and some of the stuff that we were just discussing earlier as a term, in a way that organization is a little narrower. Again, the social one, not the organized one. Arguably, all institutions are organizations in some sense, if we take this just like definition of things in relation to other things. So we defined a concept called constitutive infrastructure. This is ongoing research, so don't take it as like a final thing, but it's ideally a functional approach to institutional architecture and implementation. And so we try to distinguish function from structure. That is to say, you constitute something by delineating its boundary, which goes back to our earlier point. Like, we have these models that are like, there's a boundary here. And like, sometimes there is. So like, we actually constitute those boundaries, and we then ideally within those boundaries can say, well, we can fuzz out some of the details of what's in there, at least from the perspective of a fractal or from a network, if we can assert the function that thing that's bounded fulfills. This is, again, a very systems engineering thing. We want to be able to unpack components and look at them, but we also want to be able to just trust them to fulfill their function. And so if we're zooming out and looking at the ecosystem, or exploring a hierarchy or a more complex system, then we kind of need the components to be boxed off a little bit. And we can say, cool, that thing does this. And to that extent, we need to be able to constitute it and have the some reliability that it in fact does do that. And it will only change so much, or maybe very little, if its environment doesn't change. But we also understand that if these systems are viable, then changes to their environment might also result in changes in response to that. And like, it gets a little tricky. I really like Danella Meadows. She talks about dancing with systems. That kind of relates to this idea that, even just two, quote, systems that are in each other's environment have a certain amount of duality. If you take the perspective of one, the other is its environment, and vice versa. And you can then go back to this kind of co-fitness, even with a simple network of only two nodes. Really what I'm getting at here with the constitutive infrastructure concept is that, like, we can construct infrastructures or define the bounding materials or the embodying materials of a thing, and then it gets some sticky behaviors, and those sticky behaviors allow us to reason about it in composition with other things and even make statements about like co-fitness, because we're actually talking about the co-fitness of the functions which are manifest by those infrastructures or those embodiments. Keeping in mind here that I'm still working in a sort of legal institutional economic space here. When I'm talking about environments, I'm thinking in terms of Lawrence Lessig's pathetic dot theory. He wrote this great book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, and there's a newer version called Code 2.0. And he talks about these modes of regulation, markets, norms, law, and architecture. These are effectively institutional forces acting upon an individual, and it's generally put forth in a relatively negative light. Like, hey, it sucks. People have all of these forces on them, and like, what are we going to do about it? We just deal with it. I like not that. I like looking at organizations or the kinds of institutions that we build or these infrastructures that we design, develop, deploy, operate, and maintain as tools for counteracting, like to producing countervailing forces, or at the very least, building houses in cyberspace to shield us from the weather. And so we do this by taking the same four core dimensions that Lessig defines in the pathetic dot theory and inverting them and like talking about what kinds of things can be instituted or constituted to like hold space within these I guess kind of regulatory climates. And that means economic systems like business models, defining KPIs, service level performance metrics, service level agreements, compensation policies, and other incentives. These are the kinds of things you can make in order to create a boundary relative to the environment in the market, say. When you're talking about culture norms, you can make local norms. They tend to be built around brand identities, reputation systems, team cultures, community norms. These are things that you do to create a specific delimiting point. If you're inside of an organization, that an organization's values and mission become part of its social constitutive infrastructure. Legal side, entities, bylaws, contracts constitute the relationships between entities. You have terms of service, non-disclosure agreements, contributor agreements. These are pieces of legal machinery that can be used to define boundaries or relations. Finally, technical is closer to this architectural notion because it affects what you can do. So whether it's physical technical or digital technical, ultimately you're altering the set of actions available, not just how we choose which actions to take. And so we view this as a decomposition of the kinds of infrastructures that one can create in order to hold space. And this is important because we operate, at least our company, entirely digital. We work with a lot of entities that exist in a, sort of beyond the physical realm. And so our environment is best understood as made up of some sort of technical capabilities, some sort of like social normative boundaries, some legal entities, and sort of business models and expectations about the behavior of people with regards to resources, whether those resources are financial or non-financial. And so, almost done with this section. I just basically narrated this already. So this is a whole system, means that we don't really want to look at these four things as separate. When you're creating an organization or an entity of some kind or reasoning about the viability of a individual organization or a group of people within a network, you need to be able to think about how space is made for them or held for them, how boundaries are actually constituted, and how the environment inside of the boundary is different from the environment outside of the boundary. So there's almost like a homeostasis thing going on. You constitute boundaries so that the conditions inside the boundary are more conducive to a certain set of activities, relations, behaviors, et cetera, activities. I'm particularly very interested in research. I try really hard to create environments that are conducive to researchers doing research without being super stressed about where their like paycheck or rent's going to come from. So finding ways to make spaces that are good for researchers. is very important to me. But ultimately, we're still reasoning about these things in their environments, where their environments have non-trivial positive and negative externalities. So just about done with this section. Two papers that you can find on SSRN. One is more like institutional, the method of functional decomposition of organizations and their environments, kind of just talks through a method for breaking things down according to this pathetic dot theory. And the block diagrams for categorical cybernetics is very much a math paper built on top of the generalized dynamical systems. And it really thinks about how we build out models where you can have zooming and tearing and linking, and a kind of block diagram as graph topology of the relations between a bunch of different component dynamics. And with that, I will pause before jumping into some experiences building orgs. So that's a chunk of like ongoing research, things I'm really excited about, but also the work that informs my work on building organizations in general. So seems like a good place to pause for comments and feedback.
Okay, any comments? There have been a few comments in the chat. Anyone would like to jump in?
Yes.
Marcus.
Yes.
Please.
Michael, I'm very intrigued by your presentation. Now, if I refer to your fourfold diagram, economic, social, legal, and technical, I wonder where is the ecological dimension?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I, weirdly enough, tend to think that in our current standing, it appears in economics and technologics, the technical, but economics for me is very broad. So like I think about it in terms of relationships and value flows, not necessarily in a monetary sense. And so if I were to focus on, and I have done some work on sustainability measurement analysis and markets. One of the things I find most frustrating about the current state of our reasoning about ecological systems is we don't think of them as part of our economic models. You have systems that need to be viable. They are part of our co-fitness structures. And insofar as any particular institution at a very micro scale that's interacting with its immediate environment, or an institution at a very macro scale, like a multinational, is actually got a notion of co-fitness or lack thereof with the basically biosphere that contains it. Now, the way in which one would make that analysis really depends on scale, because I would think very differently about, let's say, the level of a particular farm or commune and its economic activities in relation to the maintenance of the soil, water, etc., and like a multinational corporation's negative externalities vis-a-vis, let's say they're operating a bunch of GPUs and they're burning through tons of power and they're using rare earth metals and all of this stuff. And the question is like, okay, that set of activities and the set of activities, which is literally the earth itself, are they actually co-fit on what time scale? So this model, I will grant you, isn't constructed for the purpose of that kind of analysis, but I actually don't see an issue with doing it as long as we can bring the a model of the biological economic actor, and again, not necessarily in an fully anthropomorphized way, but just as a system which itself has resource flows and a need for viability in a meaningful co-fit sense.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus.
I don't want to take up much of the time. I love everything you're saying. In the world that I live in, and this is a bias and I probably can't support it, but I think particularly large governments, not governing, but governments and largest organizations, particularly ones that are remote from the place that they're interacting with people, the organizing, the way you're talking about it, ends up creating constraints that are usually meant to purposefully ignore certain aspects of the locale. And so I find myself working with local people, trying to have local people create institutions that don't try to go so fast or don't try to externalize their costs and I'm not blaming big government and big organizations for doing it. It's necessary for them to be the thing they are. But I think for the world that I hope for my kids, not sure they're going to have any children, so I don't get to say grandkids. I'm hoping that all of this wisdom and knowledge that you have clearly in this group as can be constantly refocused back to the level at which the externalizations are at least obvious and discussable, and the all of these dynamics you talk about can occur in conversations rather than in analyses.
I hope you like where I get. I'm gonna try to make sure I get all the way to the end because there's some stuff that hooks in there. But I will make one point now, which is I'm a big fan of Schumacher and the kind of small is beautiful, like just like generally this idea that like we want not we don't want to optimize everything to make it big. And so within that sense, uh I want to find the right way to say this. Like scale comes with some really serious costs. When it comes to like institutional economics, like bigger stuff ends up having to be more impersonal. And there's a certain kind of lossiness that comes from scaling in these like large impersonal institutions, and government in particular, to your point, by its very nature demands a kind of impersonal scale just to be legitimate because differences are delegitimizing, and that like in order to have certain kinds of variety you actually need systems that are smaller, but then in order to have systems that are smaller in a very globalized world we need to figure out what all the networking protocols look like. How do those systems cohere even if they're not consistent, like they're not sharing exactly the same ontology but they still need to interact with each other. I'm going to come back to that in one of my two provocations.
And let me add this, because I think Ostrom, in her Nobel laureate speech, did a nice job of pointing to a way to solve this, which is don't put everything at the same scale. Allow yourself in policing, allow yourself, to have a call center that scales bigger, but you still have local policing. So I'll shut up, but I'm very excited by what you're doing.
That sounds great, and the Ostrom stuff is I'm totally agree with that. Interscale dynamics is another thing that I think is widely underrepresented in people's reasoning about institutions. Like the thing that comes to mind for me is like the Lucas critique and like micro foundations of macro phenomena. But it's really not there. It's not enough. You need to actually view phenomena at the micro scale and a macro scale as affecting each other. And I have a little bit on that in a paper I wrote a couple of years ago, but definitely not enough. It needs more attention. But I'm going to jump to something a little less theoretical. So I'm not really when I tell people that I like cybernetics, I say that I'm a field cybernetician. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, just there were three people waiting for questions, but we can ask them to do the questions later if you want to carry on. Yep.
I think I think we could. I think I want to press on a little bit because there's some parts that were more discussion oriented rather than like kind of pause for discussions. Apologies to people who were pushing through, but I don't want to be out of time for the part that's designed as discussion.
I resign from asking. Okay, good.
Thank you. Cool. So a little bit of more practical. So I identify often when I talk about cybernetics, I'll say like, oh, I'm a field cybernetician, right? Like I like cybernetics, I think in terms of organizational design and control theory, but like I'm involved in making orgs. I'm the founder and chief engineer of Block Science, which is this engineering firm, which I'm actually going to talk about a bit more. So I'll just say this engineering firm for now. I'm a board member and research director at MetaGov, which actually I think a lot of you would find really interesting. It's a nonprofit organization focused on participatory digital governance. This data trust superset is a little earlier in its life. I've been working on it for well over a year, but it's got a lot of, let's just call it like, there's a lot of work on the legal side. So a lot of it's behind the scenes, legal infrastructure, technical infrastructure for this effectively collective action type activity where we want to empower people to have more say over the terms under which they use things, because we have an economy that's very based on like data extraction and it's encoded in terms of service, but there's no like lever for collective action around whether or not a set of terms of service are appropriate. And so we've been exploring that with this data trust, and I'm a technical contributor and a member of the like kind of founding membership, like the group, the first group of members of an entity called the Mutualist Society, which is a community of practice focused on the civic sector, co-ops, unions, communities of faith, like basically organizations that are neither the private sector in the sort of financial optimization sense, and not the public sector in the sense of the government, but just like these other kind of vibrant, the variety of society tends to be made up of this civic sector, and creating viable, economically autonomous entities that can kind of care for their own communities, solidaristic groups, long-term focus. If you're interested in mutualism, there's a great book by Sarah Horowitz. In any case, additionally, I'm on the advisory councils for Active Inference Institute and NumFocus. Active Inf is, if you're not familiar with it, a pretty interesting application of cybernetic principles with some, I'll call it like mathematical models, free energy principle, etc. I'm not going to try to go into it, but it's cool. Check it out if you're interested, especially on the math side of things. NumFocus is a nonprofit that does fiscal sponsorship for open source development, particularly around scientific computing. So like with visibility into a wide range of orgs and a variety of different roles, actually, again, not looking for things that are big. None of these are actually scale-oriented organizations. They're better understood as mission-driven or purposeful organizations. I'm going to talk a bit about block science because honestly, I feel the most comfortable telling you about this company that I've been building for the last 6-7 years. And with that, block science is an engineering firm, not a tech company. My favorite way to describe this is that like tech companies make the red line go up. Engineering companies make the blue line go off. We figure out how to use things and we want them to be reliable and useful and helpful and like beneficial. Now, there's a little bit of a gnarl to that because when I say reliable, I'm packaging a bunch of concepts here. So I'll break it down quickly. So like we talk about designing structures to fulfill functions. So, structure is the implementation of a function. The function is useful. The structure provides persistence. Something that is persistent and useful is reliable, but useful to whom, right? Like, what are we actually accomplishing? So to my earlier point, like you can build stuff that is useful, but if the ends to which it's useful are problematic, then did you really do something good? So, we are at least able to bring an engineering lens without trying to impose some artificial neutrality on that technical work. There's a lot of narrative around, technology and as being neutral, and we just simply do not take that perspective because it's not actually that helpful. In real life, the things that we build do have effects, which are then, have normative interpretations, and it matters. Like, we're not trying to say that, oh, the tech is good. I mean, that's basically how you get the red line. People say, hey, all progress is in, all technical progress is better regardless. And we're a little bit more like, hey, like, what is this actually used for? Is it, and is it reliable? So that's a picture of us. So our animating purpose or mission is to bridge digital and physical worlds through innovative and sustainable engineering. We guide the development and governance of safe, ethical, resilient, socio-technical systems, leveraging emerging technologies to solve complex problems. I will say this, we did co-design to do our mission and values. I'm not going to go through all the values, but that was also a really interesting experiment to have like 20 odd people together authoring a substantive piece of text that was a kind of shelling point for our future interpretation of ourselves. Many of you have probably engaged in these kinds of activities, but for those who haven't, it's always worth doing it at least once because it's an incredible learning experience to understand sometimes how much difference there is in people's interpretation of even a few words that we take for granted. So then I'll answer this question: how is block science organized? I like this diagram. It's not quite a VSM. It is, however, a pretty practical decomposition of the way that our org works. We have a kind of executive function in the form of operations. Operations, which you'll see in a moment, does have a very, a system, the operations council is kind of a system for manifestation. The operations staff does a lot of the system 3 work. And then our primary system 1s are the research the research business unit, the whole business unit, the project council, which is where we go out and actually deliver services and get paid. And we have a communications function that basically, publishes and distributes content, manages some relationships. Effectively, the communications is an outbound. It's a kind of production, but it's not production that produces compensation. It's it's interesting. I can talk about it more if people have questions, but we sort of imagine ourselves in terms of these 3 researches where we're actually just, again, not actually getting compensated necessarily. We're reading, we're learning, we're doing seminars, we have focuses. Insofar as we have a business development machinery, it mostly looks like our outward communications, blogs, papers, lectures, and so on. We've also got team members who are not full-time, who are in professor roles, and so we get pretty well connected. We build our roots out into the system around us, and then ultimately we make commitments. So we enter contracts, make commitments, deliver contracts, get paid, and so so the project council is largely related to that. So these 3 on the right are basically our system 1, 2s, because actually the councils are effectively representative bodies for the business units. And so in a kind of sociocratic way, the councils coordinate with each other. So it's also actually important to keep in mind that these aren't departments, because there are lots of people who participate in these different functions. So this is not an org chart. Any given person within our organization is probably a member of at least 2 and sometimes several of these boxes. And so the cross unit coordination is informally basically everyone, and formally the councils, who are effectively representative circles that coordinate the activities amongst the different business units. And so I did write out there is actually in our internal company documentation, there's a version of a VSM of the company, though it's funny because it's a point of discussion. Rather than saying, the VSM of our company is, we actually use it as a lens for reflecting. So a kind of almost a system 5 level activity where the company itself will have a discussion about different VSM interpretations. And that has, among other things, led to, there's this current memo about memoocracy one of our team members wrote, which basically presents the idea that some of the system 4 and 5 activities can be distributed more effectively through the practice of writing memos. And that as long as the memos are involve individuals taking time to make sense of their own observations or their own suggestions and packaging them for consumption in a attention respectful way for others, that we can actually have a more effective distributed 4 or 5 that involves a larger portion of the company and not just representative councils. So you might find that interesting. So how does fractal relations emerge? Well, we think about things in terms of these concepts of political and functional autonomy. I'm not going to go on this too long. I've written a little bit about it. I definitely will write more about it in the future, but it's a way of understanding subsidiarity in relatively practical terms. So we generally look at situations as public forums if you are caring broadly, you want representativity, lots of people, and then not necessarily expertise. And expert forums if you need specialization and not necessarily representativeness. And so we tend to look at the subsidiary decision-making authorities as where to elicit preferences, set goals, define boundaries. And so the political side of this is what do we want? And the functional side of this is actually packaging it as something like objectives and constraints, because it becomes objective when it's framed as an optimization problem. But the optimization problem is only objective subject to the subjective act of framing the optimization problem. And so you can actually relate the more objective stuff on the right to the more subjective stuff on the left by saying that the political side of this is determining is responsible for determining that which does not have an actual answer, from which you need people to sort of sense and decide in a way that is not solvable down to an equation or an optimization. It's interesting too, because the left-right axis, which is sort of more subjective objective, is non-trivially related to the top-bottom axis here, which is closer to like, okay, what are we trying to do and why, versus like, what are we trying to do and how? The what is the binding, right? Like anyway, I probably shouldn't spend too much time on this. I find this topic really, really important in practice, but obviously this is a theory slide in the practice section, so I'm going to move on. Resources, stocks, and flows. This is a relatively simplistic view, but it can also be kind of broken down in more detail. Effectively, we look at money as only one of the kinds of resources within our company. Knowledge, skills, methods, and tools is probably the most fundamental resource, but it's a it's technically, at least within our organization, non-rivalrous, right? Like our attention is a bit rivalrous, but when we spend knowledge, it doesn't go away. It's not consumed. So there's a really powerful battery associated with optimizing for the production of knowledge skills, like durable knowledge skills, methods, and tools, because they don't get consumed when you spend them. Similarly, brand reputation, partnerships, and relationships, they can have a kind of attrition if you don't care for them. Similar with knowledge, skills, methods, and tools, to be honest. They can decay, but they don't really go away when you spend them, or not if you spend them well. And so viewing the blue and salmon or pink boxes in this way allows us to treat them in some ways differently than we do things that get consumed. So money, we have to produce it. We need to be able to pay staff to provide the experience of security, financial security, and headspace that comes with it. But like ultimately we can make more of it. So we spend it, we make more of it. We need a process of continually making it, on average in excess of what we spend, hence budgeting. But this machinery about turning our brand, reputation, partnerships, and relationships into opportunities for funded projects, so like a sales pipeline, leads, grant opportunities, etc., and then actually executing on those transforms that into an actual funded project, which means money, but it means commitments, which we then have to deliver on. And so it all kind of ties back together. But this is a kind of abstract view of a dynamical system where for us, viability in a sense means being able to keep this thing flowing in a way that doesn't run out of anything. So that's my resource view. Finally, kind of network view. Another kind of cartoon drawing. I could probably talk about it for 20 minutes, but the gist of it is that rather than collapse things into hierarchies, we can think of them as graphs where you have a bunch of stakeholders who are like participating in or informing context-specific decision-making outcomes. So like you might have decision-making authority in the sense of like a RACI or DAISY chart where like one person is going to be the one who makes the call and there's a variety of other relations defined, but you can have lots of decision contexts and you can have lots of different roles in different decision-making contexts. So what I find really interesting is that you get a much more balanced power graph if people, sure, like you have the decision-making authority in this context, but like, and I'm just giving you my advice, but like that's going to be flipped somewhere else. And so if you were to think of this as a directed graph or even a time varying directed graph implied by, technically what I've drawn here is, if you think of it as a matrix with n stakeholders or stakeholder groups and m decision-making authority contexts with directed edges. You could also, construct Laplacians and do some cool algebraic graph theory stuff to get a sense of, how well connected or how well mixed those graphs are. Not recommending that we go down that rabbit hole too far, but just reminding you guys that I'm a network scientist and mathematician, control theorist type. So when I draw pretty pictures, they basically always mean math things. But ideally here, I have this distributed networked decision-making process with a lot more variety, but then the actual topology of these graphs in the specific organization is what we might call organization in this earlier sense. In the how is it organized? What are those decision-making like contexts, and which stakeholders are part of them, and what are their specific roles within those decision-making contexts? And in some ways, that's a generalization of a sociocracy. If you define the decision-making context as circles and you define the stakeholders as members of those circles, you will get a non-trivial graph topology in basically any real organization. And it has to do this process of experiencing the world, making decisions, driving changes in the world, and so on. So you still get a cybernetic feedback loop, but you get a cybernetic feedback loop less as a monolithic thing. And back to this discussion of ecosystems and networks versus organizations, this I would argue kind of blurs that again. It's like, well, we can construct an organization in the graph relationship sense, which is actually a representation of an organization in the entity sense. That's not to say that they're equal, just to say that there are conditions under which the representations can be aligned with each other. So now I'm going to wrap up this section almost kind of on time because I wanted at least 30 minutes for provocations. Rolling this back up to the firm. So here's a view of block science again. This one is like actually even a little closer to VSM in the sense that I've got some elements of the environment here. So you've got the communications function, which has both its sort of core staff unit doing stuff, and they engage with the environment in the form of audiences, and they have a council, which is effectively kind of coordinating with the other councils and is a kind of representative body. Same is true for, research has its own kind of local environment. It's got its internal coordination and it's got its intergroup coordination and so on. I won't spend a ton of time on this slide, but you can kind of see that this is a system fulfilling a bunch of different functions, sharing resources, interacting with its environment, and taking in mission and values and producing outcomes. And so I like to joke that it's just another cybernetic feedback loop where this view is obviously very abstracted away. And I can be like, look, it's a learning thing. We just close the loop, and I don't know, it's a little silly. But for some audiences, this is the right view. And that concludes the talking at you section. I'm going to do, I think, max 5 minutes of conversations here because I have 2 provocations for you guys, and I primarily want your responses on those.
Great. Please go ahead with your provocations.
Cool. All right. First provocation, knowledge networks. I have a brief review of the concept. So here's a organization as a node in a graph. We've got actors, we've got interfaces, we've got data, we've got rules, we've got technical infrastructure, and we've got actuators and sensors. This is from a article I wrote called on knowledge networks, or language for knowledge networks related to LLMs. Fun part is that we're actually running experiments to connect these things to each other. So we have an internally built knowledge management system with LLM interfaces that we're governing. We've got a collaboration with MetaGov where they have their own instance, and we are figuring out how to network them. The reason why this is the provocation is because I want to know what people think we can do in a world where 2 organizations can talk to each other, not necessarily just in the human to human, but also in the org to org, because we're actually starting to give ourselves the tools that can turn at least our organizational knowledge bases or libraries into increasingly agentic systems that can do things like answer questions or take actions. And so this is a kind of AI as institution building tool with awareness that like these systems have to be built and governed. And in fact, in order to represent an org, they need to be governed by that org. But like imagining that we have that kind of thing, like how do you guys see organizations changing, whether that's governments, whether that's companies, whether that's, ecosystems instead of firms, scales? I'm basically working towards basically peer-to-peer networked infrastructure to kind of decompose firms and or not eliminate them. I just like small. So like I like my small company, max a few dozen people. I like my, the nonprofit I'm part of, which is a pretty active but like aligned community. And rather than make big things, I want like macro scale sense making from like max meso scale orgs. And I want to know what people think about that, what you think about technology and organization. Anyway, so I'm going to pause. That's the first provocation. It's like knowledge infrastructure with networks, LLMs, data systems, go.
Well, thank you. I think that this is a lot of information that you are providing us and a lot of interesting discussions. I think I will make a comment, but let's allow Marta, that has been waiting for a while, to have her comment, and then I'll come in. Marta.
Oh, thank you. No, just to let you know that I really, as Zargham, I really enjoyed very, very much. Although, as Angela was saying, it's too complex, and it's double complex for me because I don't understand everything due to my English, which I would say is like 70%. But there's a lot of questions that I will review. Anyway, I have two things to say. One is that I was kind of surprised when you said about these three parts of the governance as ecosystems as organizations, where you talk about governance, economics, and technology. And in economics, you point out two factors, the main ones which you're addressing, which is resources and actors, or that you are thinking. But I think that it's not bad. But I'm asking because relations in economics, I would say, is the most important, really. And from relations, because when we say about relations, we are talking about the needs. Okay, needs is another one, which is, I think, should be, and no, the previous one, when you're saying that the three aspects of the technology, the infrastructure, the technology, the economics, and the governance. Economics, technology, governance. Okay, yes. In economics, you says resources and actors. And I'm asking what are the relations, because for the economics, I would say the relations is so important when you're talking about the transportation, the marketing, the payment, the communications, everything that is in there. So that's something that was lacking to me. Also, not only resources, but needs. If you're thinking about economics, I always think about needs as something which resources are able to cope with those needs. Okay, that's something that I just want.
I'm happy to. So the short answer is that these are like, there's a lot that I'm trying to get through on this diagram. The way I imagine that is that like there are, again, graphs, and like actor to actor edges are relationships. So if I say economics is sort of made of, in this really reductive way, to be like, oh, resources and actors, just take that for a moment and imagine that relationships are sort of like edges between actors. Needs are a kind of edge between actors and resources. And so like it's a really, really compressed ontology to try to describe it this way. But I do actually think that relationships are pretty central to what economics is. And this is one of the reasons why I talk about the difference between personal and impersonal institutions. You often need to construct systems or spaces in order to hold back impersonal institutions to make space for personal ones. So like insofar as you want a environment in which at least in our modern context, where interpersonal relationships and things like mutual aid and other kinds of let's call them social phenomena that are relational in nature can exist and persist. you actually have to create spaces which hold back impersonal institutions like transactional markets and like large government entities, which actually systematically like impersonalize things. And so there's a tension between personal and impersonal institutions. And I actually think that personal institutions are incredibly important, but it's one of the main reasons why I advocate for small scale and networks, is because by shrinking things, it makes it a lot easier to actually preserve the relational or personal models. The bigger something gets, the almost necessarily that personalization goes away, for a lot of reasons, ranging from availability of attention to like legitimacy and fairness.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you,
Sí,
Zargham. The other thing is in this last one, the provocation you're saying, I'm also lacking something. I mean, everything on this presentation is provoking a lot of things, and there's no time really to get through. We are here in Colombia trying to do something about getting together a social organization from all for all to all. And all these points are so important, and we've been looking at them through the viable system model. But you have a lot of things that are very concrete that I would like to continue looking at. But anyway, when you're saying about these two relations on technology and communication, social communications, and the machines were talking together, there's, I would say, a third role, which is the communication among the technology and the persons and the people. I mean, that adaptation and that point there. So that's only just because that provoked me, that thing, who's this understanding and addressing this technology from the companies, not only the social thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one thing I'll say about this is it might be just a lack of my knowledge about what the current knowledge of this community is, because a lot of the communities that I am operating in, a lot of the assumptions implicit in this provocation are what I would call like pretty standard. Everyone's super excited about LLMs. There's a lot of people with technical backgrounds building software. There's like a certain level of understanding that our organizations, as we understand them, are very data driven, and that like what I'm talking about is the way in which we have been experiencing this what I'll call universalization of ontology associated with information infrastructure, particularly around language. And so this is basically saying, what if we could break that assumption of universal ontology and simply allow organizations sort of ownership over their local ontology, yet provide them affordances for linking with each other anyway. And so this might have been like a little bit of an overreach in terms of like where I thought the baseline knowledge about these particular emerging technologies are. So I'm happy to also like roll it back and talk about any aspect of this, but it's an area where there's a lot of enthusiasm in what I would consider the rising generation of people who have similar values and interests to the cybernetics community. So something worth something that I've provoked in those communities and gotten like really active discussions out of, and it's actually making me realize like where some of the gaps are, because they need help with the cybernetics concepts, but like this stuff is like their bread and butter.
Thank you, Marta and Michael. I would like to refocus again in the topic of the webinar, because we have very little time left, and for our community in particular, it's very interesting to see the relationship between BSM and DAOs, and even if you have presented the way that you interpret the BSM in your company, I think that we are all still anxious to know, how do you see this relationship between BSM and DAOs? How do you see that the BSM can contribute to designing DAOs? I can see that you have expressed the way that you have interpreted the BSM, and we could spend another half an hour questioning your interpretation of the BSM in your company. I have many questions, but I don't want to go there because we don't have a lot of time. I would like you to more intuitively to give us your answer or your questions to this broad relationship between BSM and DAOs.
Okay, let's go for it. So provocation number 2 is DAOs, a little bit. I really like this quote. It's actually from Swan about beer. It said, even as early as 1967, second edition of Cybernetics in Man, uh, Beer wrote of the hard distinction between autonomy and centralized control, that the cybernetic model shows how naive that dichotomy is as an organizational description. No viable organism is either centralized or decentralized. It is both things at once in different dimensions. I have to tell this to people who are building DAOs all the time because they do the thing where they demonize centralization and lionize decentralization while they're trying to design the organizational structures, which you could think of as the logical centralization, right? You're going to build a set of smart contracts or a set of technically entrenched rules which coordinate activity of others that is necessarily both centralized and decentralized because you are deciding what protocols or rules to, quote, centralize around what will be universal or constant in support of decentralizing other activities. So I think that's a really important starting point. Like we say DAO, we say decentralized autonomous organization. And I always try to break these words up. Decentralized, I mean, it's an important concept, but I'm skeptical of lionizing decentralization for exactly the reasons described in this quote. Secondly, autonomous in the sense of autonomous systems, in the sense of like in some sense closed feedback loop, an autonomous dynamical system or a feedback control system. And so like, what does this actually look like in DAOs? Well, you've got some humans. They have private preferences, priorities, wants, needs, relationships with each other, any number of like real world things. And then they have 2 modes of participation, some which are like explicit admissible actions provided them by some software apparatus or infrastructure, for which they might have expectations or very clear deterministic expectations of the consequence of those actions, but they also have participation in governance. Governance is a machinery through which you change the machinery, and that means updating algorithmic policies, which is essentially the automation elements of this, the things that are coded into the DAO, or the interfaces, the user-facing software itself. And so I view these as sort of multi-state feedback systems. This isn't quite to VSM, but I'll try to get there. This is an example. This is from the paper on DAOs and cybernetics, and it just tries to make this concrete. It's an example from a DAO called OneHive. They had contributors, just people in their messaging channels in their cyberspace. They come together and form initiatives, activities they want to do. They make proposals and solicit funding from the shared treasury, and then they can basically fund their projects. Often they'll do some building before they get funding, kind of planning and demonstrate what they want to do, and then that produces artifacts. Those artifacts could be anything from documentation to new software to, I mean, literally anything. They're not restrictive strictly about what kinds of initiatives, but one of the kinds of artifacts can be new organizational code. And so in this way, they are actually modifying their own org's constitution, either in the sense that they have a document that is kind of constitution-like contributor agreement, but also in the sense of the various algorithms that administrate all of these activities. And so there was a VSM discussion of OneHive in our paper. I didn't actually provide it here because one of the provocations was to ask the group what they thought about this. So I will stick to my opinion that as a view, VSM is best understood as something that we map onto a real thing. And so I'm actually usually really interested in how people map it onto systems. Obviously, it's helpful to also distill one and use it, operationalize it. But part of my provocation was going to be like, how does this relate to people's existing understanding of cybernetics when we have such explicitly software constituted, coordination systems?
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. We have one question from John Lee.
I just want to say that you've given us 1,000 things to talk about, and you keep provoking us, and it's really wonderful what you're doing. You've got such command of VSM as a language that you're articulating many things effectively, but we're an over-centralized global economy. So decentralization is a value that needs to be balanced within whatever we're evaluating. And then look at the specific layer that is appropriate. I think your ideas are wonderful, and I'm delighted to hear what you're saying. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Just a comment from me. I think that the issue of governance, the topic that is fascinating for me more as a question than because I don't have answers, is how you can take the ideas of BIA in governance in terms of creating decentralized autonomous organizations. Because basically, what is it, how can we have systems that are autonomous, that are decentralized, that are self-regulated? And this is an idea in a real organization have enormous implications in terms of how do you create your governance systems and so on. I think that what is fascinating is that the possibility that the technology offers of having institutions, networks that are self-governed through codified codes of norms and rules that the computer is that have been agreed by people, but the computer is dealing with, which allows requires much less interaction and negotiation between people once the rules or the norms have been agreed. And I guess that is this step, very deep step in terms of the possibilities of the technology that is allowing us now to see things that in your community that you are doing in terms of governance and organizations that we haven't seen yet in more traditional organizations. So I guess that this opens a really, really big and fascinating field of research. And that's exactly what we would like to invite our community to continue doing. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But let's allow Bernard to comment, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, very fascinating, and I like how you make this connection now to DAOs. It made me think of the failure of the crisis of Bitcoin. What was that, about 5-6 years ago, when the problem had absolutely, that the mining slowed everything down. It had absolutely nothing to do with the data and software part of it. It had to do with governance, because they had absolutely no mechanism of getting rid one of the central governing body's members, because that, they haven't thought of how to do that. How to elect, yes, how to get rid of them. There was just no mechanism thought about. What I realize is this: I think the VSM can be extremely helpful here, and it can be helpful. I'm using it, and I see myself often in the kind of Cassandra corner of movements in terms of self-organization and similar things, in terms of, hey guys, don't switch off your brains just because you think you found a new silver bullet. Let's think. And what I love about the VSM, especially there is a Swiss colleague of mine, Martin Pfiffner, who describes in terms of 3 ways of describing an organization. He makes the connection to the human body, where you have the anatomy, which would be kind of structure, organizational structure. You have the physiology, which has to do with processes, and you have the neurology as another perspective on the same kind of organization. And of course, the VSM would be a language to express that: functioning, control, coordination. The great thing about the VSM is exactly that it doesn't already connect to people doing the job, or which little field in the org chart is now responsible for system 5 and so on. Then when you find and when you get people to follow you there, that you say, let's talk about what the system 5 does, without already thinking about who is it who then does that stuff. You can actually take some tension out of that conversation. At the same time, I then use this to bring in what I call some functioning principles of any kind of organization, no matter how centralized, decentralized, and so it is. And they go along the line of, as soon as you have an organization which has a purpose, no organization has enough resources to do everything that looks like a good idea in the means of this purpose. That means it has to prioritize and focus. As soon as you have division of labor, different perspectives are not people related, but structure related, have different ideas of what the best focus would be. Therefore, and then we are with this kind of system 1 and system 3 relation, or the vertical and horizontal in the VSM, in terms of let's design something where local units can be as autonomous in just following their local logic of performance as much as possible, but where that doesn't make sense and you need a coordination, that this coordination, if necessary, can impose things that are in the interest of the overall against the local interest, even if it's against the opinion of this local. And by the way, that brings us back to networks, because usually that's the moment when local units or people then say, okay, I leave, because you cannot enforce anything, impose anything on them. And so when you discuss about these functions before then talking about, is this some kind of general assembly, finding some general rules and then something digital doing or AI doing decisions according to these rules, or what is it? Then you discuss the how, but you have to get the what clear before you talk about how it is actually done. And I see many mistakes being in that lack of clarity on the what, and not in kind of then how do we build it into our interaction between digital agents and human agents.
So I want to see the floor after two comments, because I believe there were some follow-ups at the end and we're coming to the end. So two things. One response for Angela's comments. There's a forthcoming paper that's under review on attention economies with Kelsey, a researcher named Ronan, and Nathan Schneider, who is someone who's published on platform cooperatives and stuff on attention and governance, and really exploring, mostly with Web3 examples, the kind of decision-making apparatuses. I lost the thread because we jumped into a different topic, but when you were speaking, I was like, oh, I really think this is going to be useful and helpful for this bridge between cybernetics and in particular governance and participatory governance. So I want to pin that as a thing to come back to in the future. Please remind me. And that with response to Bernard, there's a chunk of work that wasn't in what I presented, because obviously I already tried to give you guys too much, but that's also ongoing, and with one of the collaborators who's here, Alan Ben-Mir, on legitimacy, actually, and looking at the way in which people's, how context appropriate a particular governance structure is to the problem it's solving, the function it's filling. And this can be really important because whether people perceive a decision-making process to be legitimate will affect whether they, for example, leave. If they don't agree with the decision, they might still agree with the process, or they might have a, faith in the overall viability of the system, that like there's a certain amount of low-pass filtering that can come only if people actually develop what is effectively relationships to, whether they're organizations, governance structures, institutions, like there's certain amount of like kind of faith in the thing on a spatial or temporal scale other than the self that's necessary to preserve our relationships to organizations and each other, even in the presence of those systems making decisions that we don't prefer, don't agree with, etc. And so like there's, I think, actually a really necessary inquiry into the ways in which we produce and maintain those relationships, not just with each other, but with the systems that we construct, in order to actually make them viable. Because if everyone leaves, is it still even alive? So anyway, I thought that'd be important, but I want to pause because I know there was some final stuff that the organizers needed to do.
Yes, we have one final question from Marcus, and then the announcement from Ian and John about how are we going to continue in Metaforum this conversation about 2006. Okay, Marcus?
Thank you, Angela. You mentioned, or it was mentioned on the paper you presented, that one of your affiliations is WU, Vienna Economic University. Now that's my homeland, therefore I want to know if you teach these things out there.
I was affiliated, I think, for a couple of years. I was a guest researcher. They had a crypto economics institute founded. Basically, the original sponsoring faculty member was Alfred Taudas, and I'm still in contact with him. But I was coming twice a year and doing some lecturing and research collaborations before COVID. And then I live in the US, so my the amount of engagement with the university went down to the point that I no longer have that research affiliation. But it was, I enjoyed the visits that I had to the VU.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Okay, Ian and John, would you please explain how are we planning to continue this conversation?
Thanks, Angela. At the Metaforum conference in June of last year, we surfaced the notion of actually having an online community platform where Metaforum members could meet and discuss particular topics and learn from each other and so on and so forth. The very first, we decided to name them special interest groups. And at the conference, we decided there should be 10 of those. But the we was the conference decided, it wasn't John and myself, it was the conference itself. Looking at the responses and also the relevance of which special interest group, which SIG should we kick off first, we came to a view that it's one called DAOs and the VSM, which seems highly appropriate to what we're talking about right now. The reason to mention it now is that the inaugural meeting of that special interest group, we are planning to do it next Wednesday, the 7th of February. Right now, we don't want vast numbers of people in the special interest groups because that gets difficult. We're looking for maybe 15 or 20. Right now, we've got 12, 13, 14 people who expressed interest in the conference and have said they'd like to continue with that. If anybody here would like to know about that special interest group and potentially be a part of it, just put your name in the chat box and or email us, my email address, and it's John Waters. Say hi, John. There's John. It's John Waters and I that are working on this. So you can email either of us if that's of interest to you. I promised Angela I get this done in less than 2 minutes. I'm now at 1 minute 29. So I'll say that's okay for now. But that's all we wanted to talk about, okay? I also promised Z would be brief as well. Done.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Let's hope that some of you will join us in this conversation that is fascinating. And Zargham, this has been fantastic. You just left us full of questions. So I think that this is such a complex issue and there is so much to learn that I just think that this just demonstrates that we need to continue the conversation. We need to go deeper. There is a lot to learn between your community, our community. There is this beautiful link in all the basic cybernetic principles that join us together. And I think that this is fascinating. So only thanks to you. People are asking for the presentation. So as we agreed, we hope to have your PDF with the links. And please get in touch, anyone who wants to continue with us. Thank you very much. And we'll upload the recording in our webpage as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
It was great. Thank you.
Thank you. See you very soon in the next webinar.
Just very briefly, people have already responded to the chat box that they'd actually like to be part of this initial SIG on DAOs and the VSM. I've saved the chat. I have saved the chat. So hopefully I'll have people's names that are interested, okay? If we don't respond, have you got my or John's email address? Very strictly.
Put them in the chat, Ian, please.
Yeah, I put it in the chat earlier to do with David Beatty's Lighthouse Cafe, which I need to get to doing the prep on that. Hang on, here I go. I am iank1024@gmail.com, which is now in the chat box. There you go. If you could possibly just drop me a line saying, yes, please, I'd like to be involved or I'm interested or what have you, I will make sure John and I include that in our plan.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to then close the session. Shall we wait for people to respond, Ian?
Unfortunately, I have to go. We've got the Lighthouse Cafe, we've got a pre-meeting for that. It's a bit like that. So out of one Zoom meeting and straight into another.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Okay, bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye for now.